A discussion like this customarily begins with the interviewer asking how you came to write this book, but you answer that question so succinctly in your book's subtitle, Coming of Age Between Arabs and Israelis, that it makes the question kind of superfluous. So I guess I want to break with convention and ask a different sort of question. How is it that someone who came of age between Arabs and Israelis then came to be the biographer of J. Robert Oppenheimer?
Well, that's a very good question, because though my whole childhood was spent in the Middle East, and I spent part of my university career there, and I went back as a reporter, I have really tried not to write about the Middle East. It was sort of an abdication, but I discovered in my 20s that it was, at least for me, an emotional black hole. It was just very difficult to grapple with. It was always controversial. And so I ended up writing about the American foreign policy establishment, and wrote a book on John J. McCloy, and then the Bundy brothers, and eventually J. Robert Oppenheimer with my friend Martin Sherwin. But in 1990-91, during the midst of the first Persian Gulf War, I felt a flood of sort of childhood memories coming back, and I felt compelled to write at least an op-ed, a short piece, 800 words, in the Washington Post, and I described my earliest childhood memory, which is really of crossing Mandelbaum Gate, this very dreary, grim gate, sort of a checkpoint Charlie of a very much divided Jerusalem in those years. Had tank barriers, cone-shaped cement tank barriers that you weaved in and out of, and rolls of barbed wire, and a checkpoint with the Jordanian soldiers, and then 100 feet away, the Israeli checkpoint. And I told a story in this op-ed about going through the gate one day, because we lived in East Jerusalem. My father was assigned to the consulate in the Jordanian sector of the city, but for a time I went to school in the Israeli sector in West Jerusalem, and I was a privileged little boy. No Arabs were going into Israel, and no Israelis were passing through Mandelbaum Gate to go to Jordan. It was just diplomats and the occasional tourists during Christmas season or something. And one day we'd gotten through the gate, at least the Jordanian part, and we were approaching the Israeli checkpoint, and suddenly I cried out to my father, "Daddy, Daddy, stop the car." And he turned around in astonishment and looked at me, and I was grappling with something on my T-shirt. It was a button that a friend in the Jordanian sector had given me with the image of Gamal Abdel Nasser. And, Nasser was, I knew, even as a little boy, that Nasser was wildly popular throughout the Arab world, and in Jordan and Egypt, where he was president, but that he was the enemy of the Israelis. So in my childhood naivete, I thought that wearing this Nasser button was going to make the Israeli soldiers angry with me, so I had to get it off. So I was very keenly aware of, the conflict, the borders, the divisions, the animosity. So I wrote about this in the op-ed, and about growing up in Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and Egypt. And then I talked about the fact that I had, as a young man in my 20s, had a sort of another sort of metaphorical crossing of Mandelbaum Gate when I met Susan Goldmark and fell in love with her and married her. And she's not only Jewish, but the only daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. And her half-brother is here in the audience this evening. And so I had to tell that story. And at the end of I'm sorry I'm going on, but this is actually how the book got written, because Susan turned to me and she said, Kai, when it was published in the Washington Post in 1991, she turned to me and she said, Kai, this is the best thing you've ever written. I don't know why you're trying to write these boring history books and biographies. Why don't you write about your childhood in the Middle East? Susan is very bright, and I try to listen to what she tells me, but I couldn't. And I went on to finish my big, fat 800-page biography of John McCloy, and then spent 7 years on the Bundy brothers and the Vietnam War, and then 5 years on Oppenheimer. And only after winning the Pulitzer Prize in 2006 did I feel prepared and armored to turn to the Middle East.
I was hoping you could describe the milieu that you grew up in, or at least in Jerusalem. It's something that you describe in the book, but from an adult's perspective, which I imagine was at points at odds with your child's view, but I was hoping you could describe that briefly.
Well, Jerusalem in those days, and particularly East Jerusalem, the Arab sector, was a very small place. It had a population of no more than 65,000, maybe 70,000 people, including the old city. And it was a small town. And my father, who was a very garrulous young Foreign Service officer, knew practically everyone, including a very opinionated woman named Katie Antonius, who was sort of the dragon lady, high society lady of East Jerusalem, held a salon in her house frequently and gathered the journalists and local diplomats. And Katie was a Palestinian, Christian background, and the widow of George Antonius, who was the sort of first great Arab historian of the 20th century, who wrote a book called The Arab Awakening to try to explain the rise of Arab nationalism, oddly enough, simultaneously with the rise of Zionism in the early 20th century. George Antonius had died in 1942 or so, but Katie was still very much a fixture of Jerusalem society. And, I had a childhood friend, for instance, who my playmate at the time was a neighborhood boy who, his father was a Palestinian Muslim, but his mother was Jewish German immigrant from Germany in the 1930s who'd landed in Palestine and met this Palestinian who she fell in love with, and Danny was the product, so he had a foot in both communities, so to speak. It was as I'm trying to describe it and remember it, it was a much smaller place and much more cosmopolitan, and yet divided. And we lived on no man's land on the edge of Mount Scopus, just below Mount Scopus, where there was an island of Israeli control and barbed wire, and occasionally, it wasn't uncommon at night to hear gunshots fired or an explosion if a donkey happened to wander through no man's land and trigger a landmine. But I was a young boy, and I thought this was a normal childhood.
You say early on in the book, rather provocatively, I thought, that the two bookends of your life were the Shoah and the Nakba, which is Arabic for catastrophe, or what the Arab world considers the 1948 War of Independence. So if these are the bookends, well, first of all, both came before you were born, but if these are the bookends, isn't that a lopsided shelf?
Well, what I meant to imply there was that as a young boy and adolescent and even a reporter wandering around the Middle East, I was keenly aware of the plight of the Palestinian refugees and sympathetic to their cause. But I fell in love with Susan, and I had to learn about the Holocaust in a very personal way. So when I was first taken to my mother-in-law's apartment in New York, Susan at one point took me aside and opened the closet door, and literally, there was nothing in the closet except one packed suitcase.